on. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Founders Grid, sponsored by Gaper.io. Today we have Shane. Shane is the CTO at TeamSnap. Shane, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
A bit background about yourself, what you've been doing prior to TeamSnap.
Yeah, sure. So prior to TeamSnap, I spent a decade as a data scientist while also starting an open source project called Ruby Money to handle money in the Ruby programming language in a reasonable way. Started code school for a while. I am a lecturer at the University of Michigan in the comp sci department.
Got it. Got it. So, okay. And so you've been 8 years now at TeamSnap. Can you elaborate more on how the journey has been?
Sure. Yeah. So I joined TeamSnap originally because they were a remote company. I wanted to try that out, having done the startup and the open source projects myself. And so that's kind of where it started there. Is I started as a developer working on the project, about the second or third engineer, depending on how you look at it, and helped build it up. So we had our product market fit and needed to start scaling out. So helped build the platform, ultimately becoming an architect and a director and CTO for the last 5 years.
Hmm. Got it. Got it. So engineering is something, engineers have built teams remotely while because of COVID, most of the world has been forced to work remotely.
Sure.
So, how difficult and challenging has it been for you to work remotely? And since being a CTO for 5 years, have you been able to manage teams remotely easily?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a learning curve. We had the luxury of being founded as a remote company, so we've been doing this for 12 years and failing and learning along the way, such that COVID didn't provide a real challenge from there. But there's a lot to learn. Doing a remote is really only part of the journey of of a company that here. Remote is kind of simply where you work, and you really have to start changing how you work if you want to take full advantages of the ability to distribute your employees across the country or the globe and the different time zones and such.
Got it. And so if you have teams like spread out across multiple time zones, what are the three top productivity hacks that you've developed? Like if you have them like 10 hours apart. So what are the productivity hacks or what organizational things you've adopted to manage all?
Sure. Sure. So first and foremost, you have to actually go into with the mindset that time zones just don't matter. I think a real common action people will take when they're starting with remote teams is to look at what time zones have overlap and try to plan for lots of high touch meetings and such during that time. But that's really not effective. People, when they go full remote and distributed, their time, they don't work normal 9 to 5s, or they might not prefer to, and so you really have to step back and take your time to understand where the best work hours are for people, especially developers. They need to get stuff done. If you're trying to put a status meeting in the middle of their best focus time, that's not going to do any good. So, productivity hack one is ignore time zones and talk to the team and really understand how they're working. Number two is move as much asynchronously as possible. As much communication should be done, and take a cue from open source communities where almost everything is done async and it's slow communications. Do it that way. You'll find just a lot better work done. You don't need to have a daily stand up where you're giving statuses all at the same time. In fact, you probably don't need a 24-hour check-in status. You need something that actually does status continuously, based on how people are working. So there's plenty of different methodologies, and find what works for your team there. And you'll be great. But don't just rely on what you did when you were in physical contact with each other. Really re-examine it. And a third tip for remote development is, um, really pair people up, especially people new to remote, with somebody who's doing it a while. So often when we're pairing folks up when they join, we think of it in terms of seniority, of let's pair a senior developer with a junior or whatnot. um, if you have a junior developer who's been doing remote for several years, and a new senior person comes in, it may be better to actually pair up that junior person who's been doing remote with the senior for a longer time, because there's a lot of muscle memory in the in-person space of working that they need to recalibrate. And so having somebody that's experienced there is much more sensible than having somebody who is maybe on the same technical level but hasn't done the same amount of remote or distributed work.
Hmm. God. So, which brings me to my next question in regards to mental health. After
Mhm,
COVID, everyone has been forced to stay at home, and with primarily teams in bigger cities like New York or San Francisco, where departments were small, right?
mhm,
So in May, June, July, teams started realizing that the teams are getting burned, right? So
mhm.
did you face kind of like those similar challenges, and what steps or measures you took at TeamSnap to overcome them?
Sure. Yeah. So we definitely everybody experiences those for probably different reasons. Since TeamSnap was already remote, we weren't experiencing the burnout of it being our first remote gigs and not knowing how to turn ourselves off and disconnect from work every day. It was more of that leaning in, especially in our industry where we had to lay off folks because people weren't playing sports as much. That there's just a lot of burden. You're feeling this sense of burden and constantly going to make it all worth it for the people who were laid off or furloughed. And so there was these mental breaks of like we had to not just tell people to take vacation and take time, even though that was really hard and you couldn't go anywhere necessarily. But we had to lead by example. And I, for myself, had to take 2 vacations. Not necessarily, I did need them, but just as much as an example to really show that people you can take time off. And then we do have to talk a lot about mental health and being very open about it. That's if you can build trust in your teams, which takes a lot of effort, especially in a remote space, to be open about your mental health on a daily basis, you can have the team come together and not rely. I think one of the uh, things to know about remote work and human nature in general is when you're by yourself, you tend to naturally think of the worst possible outcomes. It's a way our brain works. And so knowing that, especially with remote workers, and they've gone from being in an office all day with somebody nearby, even if they're not communicating, to being isolated and alone, even if they're with family potentially, of their brains just going to naturally go darker. And so the more we can bring up and talk about that and just make an effort to stay communicative and also to make an effort to share when we're however we're thinking, it does a lot of help, I think, to just keep mental health. And but ultimately there's burnout. Like right now, people really need to be taking time off during the holidays. Nothing's going on. Take some time, take a breath, take a breather. We don't have to constantly be sprinting. Um, this is a marathon, and it just we can go slow to go fast here.
God. My last question, your personal daily three productivity hacks that help you to be more productive.
Sure. My personal daily productivity hacks. Number one is I am a big proponent of checklists and automated checklists personally. So I over index on using a program called Todoist to pretty much organize everything I do. I like the feeling of constant accomplishment by doing the checklists, as well as just having a actual software version lets me automate the memory so that I don't have to remember to put stuff in there every day and it reminds me. And that's just super helpful. It helps me start the day by checking off a bunch and then throughout the day getting some of the meatier ones. That's definitely it. Other personal productivities. I keep a loose schedule, but I still try to keep a schedule. So I'm not trying to force myself on a 9 to 5 or an 8 to 3 or whatever the time is, but I'm trying to get something close to it because that's the freedom of remote and distributed work here is I can work whenever, but I want to keep something that's consistent because it helps me center myself, but I think it also helps family around you to know when you're working so that you're not working all crazy hours. And the other productivity hack is I was doing this before COVID, but I especially do this now. Is I have only my work stuff on my work computer, and I've taken Slack and email off of my phone, such that when I'm sitting around at night watching TV and by habit pick up my phone to start scrolling through stuff, I'm not immediately jumping into work without even thinking about it. I'm actively having to choose to go to sit down and work if I want to check email, and I think that just helps keep that separation. Especially in light of COVID, where you can burn yourself, but anytime in remote work, it's you want to have a good set of boundaries, and my boundaries are my work computer versus my personal device.
Wow. Shane, thank you so much for being on the show. It was really insightful. I'm sure we could have talked for another half an hour, but by marketing team, I'm forced to keep them within 12 to 15 minutes. Thank you so much for
No
being.
worries. Yeah, thank you. Have a great day.